So I had almost the entire class turn in the PMI.org paper. I thought I did pretty good. There were just a couple that didn't turn it in. If you did not turn that in, those are big points. That is a big chunk of points for this class. So if you did not turn that in, you probably should be contacting me as soon as possible and try to figure out a solution for or why you didn't do that. So we're also going to look at this week, we are going to introduce you to the paper that is due not this week, but again at the end of week 4. So every 2 weeks there's a chunk of a project or a paper or a something that is due. So this one is going to require you a couple of extra steps. So there are some details in there in the week 3 folder. You are going to have to purchase a case study from Harvard Education. So Harvard Business Publishing. Harvard makes a ton of money off these cases. What I will tell you is, as soon as I sign in, it is no longer $7.46. I believe it is $4.25 for this business case. And you may go, well, why didn't you do that through the bookstore and just have us buy it at the original? Because when I originally did this, it was going to be $15 or more to have our bookstore add in a business case because they were going to have to print it and bundle it and send it to you. So we did it this way. So it is not a huge amount of money. You can probably get away with, if you have people that you study with, I can't tell you officially to do that, but if you have people that you study with, you can probably get one case and look at it all together, quite frankly. You will not be able to do the project together, as in turning in one submission, but you will need to get a copy of this. And let me log in and I will show you what happens to the price. Mine, of course, goes a little differently, but it should drop. So as soon as I sign in, notice it drops to, and that should be the price for yours also. It should be $4.25. So not the most expensive thing that we've ever had in here in class. I cannot, because of the copyright restrictions, I like to be able to give out stuff for free. In this case, I can't do that. But again, it's fairly inexpensive for you to do that. So you will need to get a copy of this. Close R Us. We are going to use it for a couple of different pieces in here. So one of the weird things that, if you notice in there, have you ever heard of a company called Close R Us? That's because it doesn't really exist under that name. So a lot of these business cases, they've taken a real company, but to protect the innocent or hide the guilty or however you want to look at it, they have changed the name of it. So as you're working through and you're reading this, you'll probably be able to find out and figure out what it is. It is not very long, but it does have some very detailed charts and a lot of information about it in there. So it is from many years ago. So if you look at this, this is a $25 million project, 400 stores, and it was done back in, the case was published in 2005. It's 22 pages long. It's not horrible. So make sure you go out and you get that. And if I am in the right spot on Blackboard, 99% chance I'm in the wrong spot. Oh, we're not 2017. We are parent. All right, so there has been some more stuff that has popped up. So we've got some reading, we've got a quiz, and then I have a couple of different things I want to look at in here. So what you are looking for, that should link. If it doesn't, you can go to Harvard Business and you can actually search for it. For whatever reason, I am undertaking an effort to learn the Mac a little better, so I've been trying to use a Mac. I could not get it to search for on Safari at Harvard Business School correctly. So I don't know if you'll have the same case. but I actually had to use Chrome to get it to search correctly on there. So you do need to create an account, and some of you in other classes may already have an account, but you are going to create a project charter. So that project charter has a lot of different pieces. And so what I have done is I have borrowed a section here down, and we'll look at this in just a second, of some of the components of it. So it looks like it's just a form you would fill in, but it really needs to be more in depth than that form. But this gives you the parts of that form. So the other place that has a really great one is a place called pmdocuments.com. Now, pmdocuments.com, until probably in the spring, I think is when it flipped on me, you could get those for free. Guess what? They said these are worth some money. Just like if you had something that's worth money, are you going to give it away for free? No. So now they have started charging. Now you can see a lot of their content, and in fact you can look at it, but you can't download the actual form. And so there is a website there, and again it's pmdocuments.com, and it's got a lot of these. So if you need any of these documents, you're in a business after you graduate, it's probably worth purchasing them. So let me scroll over here. And so notice they have information about all different kinds of things. There's blogs. But notice what's right up here. Developing a project charter. So there is a lot of information. So what is the project charter does? And it tells you a little bit about a project charter. So this would be a great resource to do. So it says, hey, let's download it. Click, open. And it says, oh, you can see the different pages over here if you look, but they went from free to $3.99. Now, if 10 of you went together and you pooled your money and you each spent 40 cents, you could get a copy of this. You can look at it, and it's got the same items, but what's interesting is it has a lot of information behind the scenes, or at least it did, and say, this is where you put in X, Y, and Z. So this is a great resource, a website. There's a lot of other things we're going to use that'll pop up. So they have a couple of other things in here. And again, these used to be really great. Now they aren't. So they had tools for scope statements, work breakdown structure cards, dictionaries, templates. They figured out it's worth money. And again, I don't blame them. If I had an idea that was worth selling, I'd make money on it, right? Yeah, I wouldn't be sitting here. And, well, I'd still be. I like what I do, so don't take it that way. But so there is information though about every one of these. So if you look at requirements, there are things about how to create a work breakdown structure, managing change, scope documents, a rough order of magnitude estimate. So we're going to talk about this term on Thursday, something called a rough order of magnitude. We're going to talk about time today, and we're going to talk about money on Thursday. And we know that those all go together, don't we? That time and money are very interrelated, so we're going to put those together. So this rough order of magnitude, when you construct your document, your project charter, you may not have all the details of what a project is really going to cost. So it's a way that we can get some rough costs, an estimate if you want to think about it. The other term I have heard from some of you that have been in science classes, that it's a SWAG. We all know what SWAG stands for, don't you? Scientific Wild, something with an A and a couple S's and an ED, guess. You never heard that term before? Wow, all right. Learning new things every day. All right, so pmdocuments.org. Again, it's got a lot of information about it. So this project charter you're going to build, and you can go out and research what a project charter. There are thousands of examples out there, and we will let you go find those. So you're going to put some information in there. The title, the project scope, and that scope is a narrative of what you have in there. You may have things of who's the project manager, level of authority. In other words, where do they get their authority from? That sponsor, type of project sponsor. So there's a lot of pieces in there. Maybe a work site, depending on the size of the project. Notice we build right in here that stakeholders list. That becomes important. Generally, there's more than 4 stakeholders, and I hope you find more than 4 in this case. A summary of the major milestones. So in this particular class, let's look at this class as what might be a milestone. Every 2 weeks we have a large project due, right? Or fairly large for an 8-week class. So, first project milestone might be the inception. We all meet for the first day, or you find out your class is on. Second one might be that PMI.org paper's due. Third one might be the project charter's due. So those would be those major milestones along the way as you go. Your summary budget, and including some details. What assumptions you make. Assumptions. Now, you've probably all heard about assumptions. The word assumption even tells you a little bit about what happens, right? But the reality is we do make certain assumptions. So in whatever project we're doing, maybe we're making the assumption that our company is going to continue to grow at a 10% rate, if that happens to be something that the project depends on. The economy is stable. Those kinds of assumptions. That we are able to complete this project in 2 years to be competitive. That our competitors don't gain an advantage or something else in there. So those are all the places we put assumptions. We put any constraints. Does every project have a constraint of some sort? Yeah, I would hope so. So one of the best ones to think about when you start looking at this, and some of you will get to experience this in your lifetime. Some of you may have already planned one, a wedding. Is a wedding a project? Is really each wedding individual? Yeah. Unless you stop in Vegas and you go to the Elvis Chapel, they're pretty unique. Each one has a whole list of those. Are there constraints on wedding planning? Yeah. Great. I would like to fly in a helicopter and parachute out when I get married. Is that going to be very expensive and probably outside the scope of my budget? Yeah. I'd like to have an open bar for everybody I know. Probably outside the scope, because that would get very... So there are constraints, and a lot of times we think of just financial constraints, but can there be other constraints in our projects? Yeah. So think about our wedding. Can we have our wedding wherever we want to? I will say this, Lincoln and their cemetery will not let you have a wedding in it. They said no. That's a constraint. Just don't judge, Spencer. Don't judge. Why didn't I ask you that last year before we... No. Forest lawn. There are a lot of constraints. A lot of constraints we have to think about, not just financial. So there may be time constraints. Great. You can get a wedding dress. And in fact, anybody here shopping for a wedding dress last year? Nope. That's good. One of the biggest wedding shops in the country all went bankrupt at once. They had like 400 different stores and they went bankrupt and said, oh no. Guess where my wife had ordered her dress from? Yeah. That was a stressful moment. It's a constraint. What happens if we do that? Now you have 3 months to find a wedding dress instead of a year. So all of those kinds of constraints. So we have financial, that tends to be the one that rears its ugly head. Time constraints. You may have environmental or legal constraints. You know, as much as I wanted to marry all 4 of my cats, I couldn't do it. Those kinds of legal constraints. And then we look at risks. What are some high-level project risks? So in a wedding planning, are there any risks that you can think of right offhand? The bride or groom not showing up, that's a high-level risk. We're not going to list all of them because we're going to do risk management, but just a few that are very, that would shut the entire project down. So, bride and groom not showing up or something happening to them, an accident on the way. That would certainly be. One of the risks that we worried about when we got married last year was my father is in his middle 80s. My wife's parents are getting up there in age. What if one of them falls ill? And they were both, unfortunately, when we first started that, not doing very well with a couple of different issues. What happens then? How do we rearrange? So those kind of high level, not everything, but you do want to think of those major, what's going to shut the entire project down. And so when you look at that business case, those are the things you're going to start pulling out of there, are those kinds of things. So business information. So what are the stakeholders? What are their expectations? We identified the major stakeholders. What do they think is going to happen? What is the criteria that says this project is successful or this project is not successful? And sometimes we have to think about that because we originally said it's going to be to put in a man and a woman, unite them in marriage. Are there things that are going to happen to change that subtly? Yeah. So what do we consider a success? If neither side of either family starts a drunken fist fight, that's a pretty good success rate at a wedding. If the bride and groom stay married for more than a day, that's probably a good thing. I used to DJ weddings, actually, and I saw a wedding that lasted probably less than 2 hours. And in fact, I didn't get all the way through the dance. And the father of the bride was telling me to, you should probably just pack up. I think we're done here. It went that horribly wrong. But this was a special case involving a lot of alcohol and some bad choices by a bride. But the bride, you guys are all looking at me. So, real short story, small town, a lot of drinking. The bride leaves with several other gentlemen. They get into a car crash. Everybody in the car is naked. The groom was not in the car, and this was about maybe half an hour after the ceremony. It was an ugly situation. Now, it's actually even more sad than that because they had actually been living together a significant number of years and actually had children together, and it was fairly ugly. So I did get paid up front. So for me, my project was a success. I got a paycheck. The dad was not so excited and happy, and it was just not a happy wedding. So that success criteria, well, that clearly wasn't successful. So we know that there's other things we can use. So what tools and templates are available? What kind of things are we going to do when we work on this project and this charter? So sometimes even that charter lists specifically how we are going to do some of the items in the project in terms of monitoring, controlling that scope, monitoring, controlling the project. Now, we haven't talked about quality yet, but in a lot of cases, quality comes in there too. There's some pieces we'll talk about in quality. But a lot of these things we're going to look at in terms of time are actually going to come in here also. So this project charter is one of the first documents that we have that says, here's our entire project from beginning to end. And so it's a very critical piece of business documentation when we look at it. So everybody have the Harvard place and that you're looking at Close R Us, right? All right, so I am going to come back up here. I will send additional information. I have a rubric I will send out. Probably on Thursday we'll talk about the rubric. What does the rubric cover? And I've worked very hard that the rubric doesn't give you any clues about this particular case. You're like, not just like, oh, dang it. But you are going to have to do some critical thought, some thinking. I know that that is something every one of you can do. Where did I put? Nope, nope, and nope. Hang on. Do I have the right one open? Ah. So, oop. Well, that was unfortunate. Hold on, let me go back to where we need to be. So we're going to talk today really quickly about time. One of the problems we have in this class, holy cow. Let's see if I can scroll up on, oh, this one doesn't give me a scroll bar. Handy. Is we need to 173, which will be close but not quite accurate because we have that pagination issue. So always fun. We want to look at scheduling. You guys are already master schedulers. You know how to work jobs. Most of you are working part-time, if not full-time. Some of you have multiple jobs. I am always astounded that some of you get anything done. I have had students who I know are working 2 full-time jobs, and they're still going to school and managing to pull that off. So we're going to talk about scheduling. You guys are already really know how to do some of this. Some of it we're going to give you a really quick formal way to do some scheduling. And so we're going to look at how we can do some estimates of time. So as we break that work down into smaller pieces, we have to think about a couple of things. So one of those is, does everybody do things at the same speed as everybody else? So right now, if I said we're going to go out and run in the rain and run around the building, are we all going to run around this building at the same speed? No. No. And you'll watch. Me too. Me too. So we know that people do things at different speeds. And if you've had employees, have you watched other people around you able to do a task that takes you 5 minutes and they can do it in 2 minutes? Sometimes. Sometimes we have ones that take 20 minutes to the same task that you take 5 minutes. And so we know that tasks take different lengths of time for different people. And even the same person, so are there days that you just, nothing seems to work right, no matter what you do, and there are other days everything just works together. And so we know that people are very variable. Even if we say, you know what, I've got a factory full of robots. Are all robots doing things at exactly the same speed? No. There's some differences in tolerances, and the robots can change, so one will be a little faster than another. So think about brand new cars. If I go buy a brand new car, and I want to go see how fast it will go, and I buy another one identical to it. So I buy 2 Ford Tauruses, and I want to see how fast they'll go. Is there a chance those 2 cars are going to go different top-end speeds? Yeah. Different weather conditions might affect that. The cars one might have been built a little better than the other. So all of that plays into some of our issues here that we're going to run into, is we need to figure out some methods that we can adjust for those times. And so I'm going to try something here. We'll see if this works. If I can get logged in, of course. Come on, silly thing. Hello, slow iPad. Apparently if an iPad is like 10 years old, they're not very fast. So, reconnect. Okay. Other screen. We're getting there ever so slowly. So we know that people are doing things at different speeds. So we have a couple of ways we can do it. And so I'm going to use a word here. Statistics are what we use for that. But we're going to show you some easier ways to do it. Everybody's had statistics and remembers everything in statistics, right? You guys all just laughed at me. How many are in statistics this semester right now? How many have not had statistics yet? Oh, all right. So, only one of you. The reality is we use those tools that you were given, but you really didn't get a context to them. You were just like, here's all these tools. Okay. It's kind of like a mechanic getting handed a set of wrenches. They don't know yet what to do with them. So one of the quick things we're going to look at is, I want to see if I can actually draw on here. We'll see if it works. So we know, and that is my bad attempt at drawing a normal curve. I apologize horribly. So we know that in the middle is that median, right? That if we ask, we'd say, well, this is where we think we are. And we know that we have out here, we have a couple of spots. on that distribution curve, right? And we know that most people are going to fall in this range here, right? We know that most people are in there. But that's a pretty good spread. And it could be anywhere from this could be 5 minutes to this could be 25 minutes to complete the same task. And I apologize for my horrible handwriting. So I'm trying to scribble on this thing, and I don't know what's all over the screen of this. I'm a little frightened. But we know that most people fit in there. And we all have the mathematical tools. Remember those Z-charts and everything in the back of your book? We're not going to do all those right now. But what I want you to remember is people are variable, and most people fall within that couple of distributions out. And so we need to remember that and how we're going to work that really quickly. See if I can erase like I wanted to. Clear slide. Look at that. All right, so what we are going to do is give you a really quick way to estimate times. And we need 3 numbers. And these numbers, remember I used that term swag? We know you guys can estimate in your brain pretty good. And so we're actually going to do something. So we are going to use 3 numbers. So let's assign a task. Let's take, Justin, I'm going to pick on you. Let's take writing a paper, a 3-page paper for this class. So we know that there is an optimistic value. So optimistic, how long do you think it would take to write a 3-page paper, optimistically? Hour and a half? 90 minutes? Holy cow. Okay, that's a fast paper. I will grade yours. Oh, very optimistic. So we also need one called pessimistic. So, Dolores, what's a pessimistic time for this paper? 3 solid days? You're working 24 hours a day? How about we put it in terms of minutes? It's a random number. It doesn't really mean anything. Let's say it's going to take you 300 minutes. How about that one? All right. So 300 minutes. What might be a realistic number? Yeah. So we have, and we do this in our own brain. You go, man, I could go to the bar. If I could get this paper written in 90 minutes, I could go down to the bar. Or go some activity. But the pessimistic viewpoint is, man, it's probably going to take me 300 minutes. So we're going to take a formula, and we're going to use all 3 pieces of those when we start doing something. So let me wipe these out again. So remember, we have an optimistic, realistic, and pessimistic. And because I can't necessarily, well, let me see what I can do here. We'll try the eraser feature out. This can only go horribly wrong. So I don't think I can do quite that. Remember my numbers, 90, 100, and 300. It really doesn't matter, but so we're going to come up with a formula. This formula is tough. So you're going to have optimistic, so I'm just going to shorten that to O, plus pessimistic, or P, plus so we're going to put realistic in there. But we want to weight realistic more than any other ones. So if I drew a dividing line and I put a 6 down here, so we have optimistic plus pessimistic plus, what would we use in there? So if I wanted to divide this out to create an average of those, how many times would I have realistic in there? So 1, 2, so 3 times. Does that make sense? So you have 1 optimistic plus 1 pessimistic plus. So is that going to work right? Or do we need Would this work better? Because what we're trying to do is divide by the number of those up there. Does that make more sense? I see where you got your number, but just to throw it in there as a way to do that. So I don't have a calculator that I can access right here. So can somebody put some of those numbers in there for me and see what we come up with? So if I have 90 plus 300 plus where realistic was it 120, Morgan? Yeah. So 120 times 4, and then we divide that whole mess by 6. $145. That's probably close. Does that seem like it might be then an estimate that we could use? So notice we have our optimistic in there, we have our pessimistic in there, but we know that we have a fairly realistic expectation about what those times might be. And as we go on, so when you first came to college and somebody said write a 5-page paper or a 3-page paper, did you have any idea about what the length of time that's going to take? No. But as you've went through your college career, now you have those experiential numbers in your head that you can then say, aha, I have from previous projects, I know that it's realistically about 120 minutes. But I know that in the past I've had to take 140 minutes or something, and I know that somehow I made a 3-page paper in 90 minutes. I would, or optimistic. So, but we can use that knowledge we have in our brain to get us some values that we can utilize. So does this make sense? This is a way that, and we didn't use any scary statistic symbols in there, right? None? Because sometimes I think that's what we do, is we scare you in some of these classes with symbols and terms. Just like when you go to the doctor. Does the doctor talk to you like a person, or do they throw out a lot of really big terms that sound scary? They do. Although the scariest word they ever threw out to me is only 4 letters long. Diet. There goes Grilled Cheese Wednesday, which I haven't actually went to for a while. It sounds really good, and I've never managed to get there. So, optimistic plus pessimistic times 4 times realistic, all divided by 6. That's an easy one to remember, right? We can all remember that. Okay, so we're dividing by 6, so we need 6 pieces up on top. So it's an average. It really is nothing more than an average. So I know I want to divide by 6, so I have a 1 realistic, 1 pessimistic, and then I need to get all the way to 6 different values up there to make it an average. So there are variations on that. You could do it with 3 and then divide by 5. So there are a lot of variations. This is just one way that we can utilize. So there's a lot of different tools. This one is just one that we use quite a bit because it's easy to program in there. Now, if you've got an Excel spreadsheet or they've already got it in Project Manager, some of these things are already in there. But it gives us a way, because we know, if you want to think about it this way, optimistically, here's your best employee. Pessimistic, it's your worst employee. And then you could use the ranges of people that normally work in there. So you can come up with a lot of different ways that you can do that. See if I can not spin this all the way to page 736 again. So, make that even bigger. Chunk, chunk, chunk. So, that's one of the things in there that we look at. And there's a lot of material in this section 6, or this time section. So we take all those documents we've had before, that project charter, and now we can come in and we can say, all right, now we need to figure out some of our scheduling. So one of the things that you're going to run into is that bar chart, also a lot of times called a Gantt chart, and you'll see that in your book. tools like Project Manager or Monday.com or any of 100 other tools out there can create these. We can do these by hand. These computers are really smart. They can do things for us. This is that idea of a network diagram, and we need to talk about a few concepts in there. You're going to hit some of these in other courses, or hopefully have. So I'm trying to hit the pieces because one of the problems I'm discovering in here is we have 8 weeks. We have a lot of material. We only have 16 class sessions. Is that right? Yeah. So it's hard to get all of this material shoved in just here in class. So that's why we have all those videos and everything else here. So I'm going to jump to... All right. So there's a term that we see quite a bit. And that term is called expert judgment. So if I asked just a person walking down the street in Omaha how long a 3-page paper would be, that's not an expert judgment, is it? No. But from your knowledge, in other words, those things that you have used before, you can have a little better idea. So expert knowledge or judgment then is that being able to, based on that specialized knowledge that you've built up as a college student. It's different. If I ask my wife, who writes papers and all kinds of things all the time, her answer might be different because she has a different intended target audience, right? If I'm going to write a paper, it's going to take way longer because I'm really slow. So I know that that expert judgment can vary. And so we need somebody in that field or somebody with some experience in it to sometimes get some of these numbers out. So we talk a lot about meetings and scheduling. This activities. So notice we have that project management plan. And now we need to break those down into activities. Those things that we can quantify via time. And so when I ask you to write a paper, you may think that's a fairly large chunk, and you may need to define that further and break it down into activities. And maybe that is the case. So what we want to do is break these down into small enough pieces that we can actually create a plan for time that is reasonable and fairly accurate. Are we ever going to be 100% perfect on time? No. But we know that we can be fairly close. So a lot of times we create what's something called a baseline. So we use some piece of software, maybe it's Microsoft Project, and we create a baseline of how much time that's going to cost. Does that timeline directly affect our cost? What's the most expensive thing in most projects? Is it materials? It's people. So think about building a house. Anybody in here built a house? Oh, your parents just built a house. All right, we'll use those as an example. So I don't want to pry into what kind of size of house. I saw some pictures. Looks really nice, by the way. So my first guess out the door, around the $400,000 mark. Pretty close? Sweet. All right. Again, if it's personal, but so how many of you get the weekly Sunday paper with Menards ads in it? No, you never looked at a Menards ad? Menards will actually a lot of times have kits. And they will say, here's everything you need for this house. Now, it's not quite to the scale of that. But it's a house that around here would reasonably sell for $250,000. And you look at it and it says, here's all the materials for it for $70,000. Now, it doesn't have all the materials because they really don't list them all. So there's some additional cost. But the reality is, in most houses, it's the labor, not the house materials, that are actually the far more expensive part. So the longer it takes to build that. So pick on you a little bit. That house looks like it's got some fairly custom features, really nicely done. Those cost longer or cost more because they take longer to build them out. The reality is, my cost on my crappy little house in Auburn, the drywall, $6 a sheet, just like it was $6 a sheet for that. But finishing it out so it looks really nice instead of my wavy wall job, that's where that cost comes in. So that schedule that we create directly drives, in most projects, that cost. In fact, there are a lot of projects where there are very few costs other than labor. Think about a software development project. Do they have a lot of costs other than a desktop computer they already own and maybe some tools, some software tools? It's mostly driven by labor. So the closer we get with that original timeline, the closer we can deliver a cost. And in fact, things like Microsoft Project can directly give us those costs because we can input things like labor values and what things cost in terms of that. So projects are driven primarily, I will suggest, by cost. So we need to think about how some of these things sequence. So we know, so there's all these other different kinds of things, but I want to look at how we sequence these kinds of things. So we know that some things have to occur in a specific order. Most of you have played a sport at some point in your life. There are things that have to happen in a specific order. Everybody in here has things that have to happen in a specific order. Can I get in the car? Do I have to do things in a specific order to make my car go? Yeah. So we know that all of those things have to go in a specific order. Our projects are the same way. And those scheduling tools can influence that because they can show us how we can do that. You may have heard it called a network diagram if you've been in Business 335 or other courses that talk about this. It's that idea of how I can schedule activities and based on something called precedence. Does that term sound unique, new? You guys are like, oh, my head hurts because I had to do these before. So we think about the terms of precedence. So my best example is always, you have to take off your clothes before you get in the shower. So there is a precedent for taking one activity versus another one. So if you step into the shower and you still have your hair in a twisty bun, I'll make fun of you over there, what's going to happen to your hair as soon as you hit the shower? It's going to be kind of a mess, right? Yeah. I don't have that issue. But I have a 7- and 8-year-old who can't remember to take their hair out of a ponytail even, and trying to get a wet ponytail out, it's a pretty ugly thing. I can remember having hair, but probably not a lot of that issue. So how we do things in order, there's a lot of different pieces in there. So So our book makes a big deal out of having 4 different types of relationships. So make sure you have read those because I do know those show up on a quiz. How was that for subtle? Is that subtle, Cheyenne? So the most common thing we have is that finish to start. So until the previous activity is done, we cannot start the next activity. And I actually like what their example is. Because, well, I'm a nerd. But it says, I can't install an operating system until the hardware is assembled or put together. Those of you that are in my networking class, and there's some in this class that are in there, and you've been struggling with this VirtualBox Windows 10 assignment, you can't install Windows until you install VirtualBox. One has to be completed before the other one begins. So, some of these are a little interesting. So, start to start. So, in other words, a successor activity cannot start until a predecessor activity has started. In other words, we have 2 activities and they overlap, but one of them has to start first. We're not done with activity 1, but we have to start activity 2 at some point in there fairly quickly. You ran into those before, and you've seen it. So when they're out there pouring concrete on the highway, there are multiple activities. So think about it that way. Have you ever seen them out there pouring concrete, and they pour the concrete, and then they actually have to go through and finish the concrete? They have to use floats, or they bring in tools, they bring in equipment. But I still can't start finishing the concrete till it's poured, right? But I can't wait until it's completely poured before I start. So sometimes there's some time constraints in there. If I think about a candy shop, and they're pouring candy in there, it has to get finished or worked before it completely hardens. That's a great example in there. So make sure you've read through these. It's a little bit odd. So there's our start to finish, our finish to start. But we also need to talk about this idea. I said precedence, but the other idea or thought about it is dependencies. That term of dependencies. Activity B is dependent on activity A or some component of component A. So there are mandatory dependencies. So they have to be done before I can do number one. So think about, I'm sending somebody, I want to send them to prison for the rest of their life, or even to maybe to the death chamber, which we've apparently now reinstituted in our state. Do I have to convict them before I can sentence them to death? Yeah, it's that mandatory. It has to happen before one thing happens or the other. So we also have some that we think are good practices, but we can change them if we necessarily need to. So when I look up here in the ceiling, you guys see this thing called a grid, and it's got the ceiling pads in it? So when I do a building, that's usually one of the last things we put up. Because up above that in a building are all kinds of piping, electrical. I have seen a couple of projects I've been involved in where the contractor, and in both cases actually it was kind of weird because they were trying to hurry up the other trades, the plumbers and the electricians. They said, we're going to go ahead and put the ceiling and the pads up. And so then, normally that's not best practice. Nothing says you can't do it, but it makes it significantly harder for those other jobs to get done, doesn't it? And sometimes we do that because maybe the people that install the pad are available this week, but not for another 6 months. So we see those kinds of weird things that happen. So it's not mandatory, and it's probably not the best way to do it, but for whatever reason, we have to do those things at the same time. So it's not, we have moved that dependency. And our software, normally we say task B is dependent on task A finishing, but so we might have to change that a little bit, and you'll see that we do that. So we also sometimes have external or internal dependencies. So the best one I can think of for an external dependency is think about Spencer's house project again, his parents' house project. When you build something like a house, you have to do building permits. You have an external constituency that says you can reach this point in framing, you have to get inspected. And if they decide not to inspect it today, can you do anything else? No. So in other words, you are dependent on that check of the framing, the check of the concrete, whatever it is. And in a lot of cases, we have these external. Maybe we're building it for a client, and that client says, well, I need to see what you've got built software-wise before I commit any more funds or go further in that project. We have a stopping point or something that's slowing us down because of that. So it's not necessarily always a bad thing, because sometimes that inspections can show you things, but I like that inspection idea as a really great way to do it. So maybe there is an internal dependency. So even though we're building this software for ourselves, maybe there's a step that a vice president has to look at it, or we don't have enough testing facilities, or whatever it is. So there can be dependencies that we have to work into our project. And so a lot of times what we'll do from our past experience building houses, for example, we know that when we reach a milestone of framing is done, that it's going to take us a while to get an inspection done. And so we will build some time in there for that. So those framers that would then go on to become drywallers, maybe we start doing a house down the road from Spencer's house. And so we start scheduling our people in alternative ways. So, but the more of those things we know about, the better we can schedule our project. There are the terms, you'll see something called lag and lead. So, in other words, how far a successive activity is in front of it. So in other words, we lead that activity or we lag that activity, how far behind it is. So sometimes we build these kinds of things in on purpose. So if we're going to do dirt work, for example, around Spencer's house, aren't you glad you get picked on a lot? Right, so when we do that dirt work, and they first go through and they grade that, and they will actually put some kind of a lag in on purpose, because yeah, we could grade it all and then seed immediately. But if you ever notice ground that's been worked once, it starts to sink. You never get 100% compaction. And so you might have to build a lag in there, in other words, till I start another procedure. Even though we could, in theory, do it directly, we build in some of that. So lag and leads can be a way that we can control things. And what we a lot of times do, because most of the time we're not just one project, we can reassign resources. So remember, we're always doing multiple things all at the same time. So we talk about network diagrams, estimating activities. So hang on a second as I go through here. Scrolling. So we have a couple of other things I want to make sure that we realize that can happen. So when we start scheduling activities, we also need to be aware of something called the mythical man month. You guys remember reading about that anywhere, hearing about that? No? So, Spencer, we're going to go back to your house again. So, we get behind and they're drywalling, they're putting up the drywall on the walls and getting it ready for paint. One of the problems we can have is we think linearly. So we think, hey, if it's going to take 10 days with one person, if I put 10 people in, it's only going to take 1 day. Is that always true? No. It's that idea of, as we start assigning more and more resources, we get diminishing returns. Each additional worker doesn't return 100%. They return 90, and then 80, and then 70. And finally, if we swamped the place and had 200 workers, they're just standing around. They can't even get anything done because there's too many people. So when we start trying to schedule things, we need to think about that idea of that diminishing returns. So yes, adding additional resources can help, but the reality is only to a certain point, and we need to know where that particular point is. So we may not have resources, so make sure you realize that. The other thing that can happen in a project is technology can change, and that happens a lot. So technology changes, all of a sudden our scheduling estimate is off. So we're used to going out there and they're leveling that ground by hand, and we had to have 10 people, and suddenly we invented a compact tractor and they dragged that over there. All of a sudden, one person does it in 1 day. So technology has changed. Think about when I think about technology, some of you grew up on farms. When I grew up, and I was in grade school, they used to say one farmer feeds like 50 people. What do you see the signs now saying? They feed like 131 or some crazy number. And that's that technology, in a lot of cases, is that difference. And, well, I love this one. How many of you wait till the last minute to do an assignment? I know, look shocked. Everybody immediately is out there already downloading that Harvard business case and starting on that. Nobody is going to wait till the last minute. But most people do. I'm going to tell you that. They wait. They procrastinate. They find other things to do. Until you get that stress of, because you've already figured out in your brain it's going to take you 3 hours to do it, so you start at 9 o'clock. So people do that at work also. I know. It's going to be shocking and scary, but people do the same thing at work. And sometimes it has to do with you have other tasks, but the reality is a lot of times you're waiting until that last minute for whatever reason. So there's a lot of motivational theory about why that's going to happen. So other things in here, make sure you've looked at the documents. Those are inputs, activity lists, assumptions, lessons learned, so what we find out. Those are really important to know. Because once we know that, hey, I can't put 10 drywallers in a small house, that I need to remember into the future. And so we look at that and we try to figure out a way that we can take that information from previous projects and apply it to the future. So risk registers are in there. So there's all different kinds of estimating that we can do. And so as you read through there, so there are things we can use. So here's the term parametric estimating. So parametric really says we know we have an entire project. We've had pieces of this before. So we know what has happened in the past. So I know that on average a house is going to cost me $150 a square foot to build. So I say, all right, you want a 3,000 square foot house, it's going to be X number of dollars. And so that's part of the other way we can sometimes get that gross budget is by using historical data. And it doesn't have to be our historical data. So in a lot of cases, businesses will share information and we can find out some of those things. So what I showed you is a version of this 3-point estimate. So the 3-point estimate here says time expected is optimistic, most likely, and pessimistic divided by 3. But it doesn't weight anything towards the most likely. So it's another way you can do it. When you construct that scheduling, you want to explain. I used a 3-point estimate with no weighting. Does that make sense? But the more data you have and the more likely things are going to be on that center, then you may want to balance it with another model. So that just happens to be. We have a term called bottom-up estimate. So we break our project into all these little small pieces. And the smaller the pieces, the better we know what people can do, in most cases. And we take all those, we funnel them all together, and we shove it up. So in other words, we're going to build a house. We know that one employee can put up 1 sheet of drywall every 8 hours or something. Does that make sense? And we take that, and then we take that entire project, break it down in all those activities, and we put them up. But we have some issues with that. We tend to want to put in things like contingencies. So maybe we come up and we say, yes, we did it this way, but we have a 10% contingency fund built into that house project. So that way, if a drywaller falls on the ground and breaks a sheet of drywall, we have both materials and time. So we will do that. A lot of times, we really do put some numbers in. Now, software does a lot of things for us, and so sometimes we can use our software to get this, but the reality is any time estimate we create has a range of probabilities with it. So we might come up with, and our software that we're using might say, hey, this project's going to take 30 days plus or minus 5 days. So that tells us that that range of that project could be anywhere from 25 days to 35 days. Does that make sense? When we do that, we generally assign also a probability to that. And so if we're doing a plus or minus, most of the time, what are we saying that probability is? So remember, there's a couple of special numbers and statistics that roughly 99 percentile, we say it's here, 95th percentile is here. And so what we're saying is 95% of the time that project is going to fit within that range that we gave it. So the flip side of that is if we say it's 95%, then we're also saying 5% of the time it's going to be greater or lower. So we really do those. And we put those into projects, and that gives us a way to say, we're going to bid this project or go out and say we're going to build Spencer's parents' house, and I still think I can make money. I only have a 5% probability it's going to take longer than X number of days, so I can set a closing date out in the future so we can get our funds out of the bank and those kinds of things. So you are going to see those kinds of numbers as you go forward, so don't be scared of them. They're already things that you need to know or that you've already learned. You know that information. We just got to get it back out of your head, because it seems like statistics is the class that as soon as you leave that class, it like pours out your left ear. That's all I can figure out. But I know it's still in there, little remnants of it. And so we're not going to go into it a lot of depth in here, but be aware of that it does show back up. Some of these things you look at, they show up again in the future, and you'll start seeing those. If you go into medicine, statistics are out there. If you go into almost any field, they're really out there, unfortunately. So it just gives us some more tools that we can do that. So again, based on what our estimates may be, we may put in contingencies. Now, the easiest way, you're thinking, well, my goodness, I'm just going to put a giant contingency in there for budget and time and cost, and that means my project will always be under budget, right? Is that a good way to do it? What would be a problem with doing that? So not getting the job. So think about that. You're competing, you go out and you ask 4 different contractors, and 3 of them are $300,000, and one says, I think it's probably going to be, it'll be under $500,000. Which one are you going to go with? Are you going to go with the guy that's $200,000 higher? And internally for a company, so you think, well, it doesn't matter because all I'm doing is software development internal to this company. But most of the time, there are competing products. And so if you are consistently over on those, you want to be as close as possible. And things like that lessons learned register give us those tools to say, hey, last week we saw that this was happening in our project. Now we can take corrective action. We don't have to wait till the project ends. And on our next project, we already know some items that are in there. So we're going to develop a schedule. We're going to put assignments in there. And so you'll see some of these things are coming back, some of these same things. So that milestone list, that seems familiar. It's probably in our project charter. And so all these documents will interlink with each other and create a cohesive product. So, come back. All right. So, we have something that you probably have heard called critical path. Is that a new term to anybody? Critical path? So, critical path comes from our business processes. We look at what path through a network. In other words, our activities, and we create them in a list by precedence and how we can do them in parallel, how we can do them in sequence. And we say, all right, through this set of activities, this is actually what we call the critical path. So it's weirdly the longest set of activities through that to get that project done. So we know that some things can't be done at the same time. We already said you can't do concrete finishing and pouring it at the same time. There's a lag between the two of them. And so we know that one thing has to start before another. You have to get undressed before you get in the shower. So we're building what's called that critical path. So let's look at this idea here. So this is that idea of network, and you've seen that before in other courses. This is a network, and in this case, there's only 4 activities. So we can construct that critical path fairly easily. So we know we have activity A, and I look over here and there's a chart. So early start, late start, early finish, late finish. So there's a lot of information we plug into these. Luckily, there is software to do this. Many hundreds of thousands of years ago when I went to college and we looked at critical path, we had to do these all by hand. It was horrible. But what we know is that we want to pick the ones, in this case, that have the least amount of what's called float. So if I look at duration, B and C can occur at the same time according to this chart. C says, I have 10 units, whatever it is, days, weeks, hours, months. B has 5 units. But they can occur at the same time. So that actually gives us then 5 units of float. Does that make sense? So we can shift B a little bit. So it could start at the same time as C, or it could finish at the same time as C. And there's 5 units of float in there. If there is float, it's generally not on the critical path. So this critical path, this says the earliest we can get this project done is, in this case, 5 days plus 10 days plus 15 days, or 25 days. That's the shortest we could get this project done. On the other hand, if I said the path in here for critical path would be ABD, so 5 plus 5 plus 15, would we be able to get the project done in that amount of time? I have to be able to look at that float, because it's the sum of those activities on that critical path. So through the top order, ABD is 25 days, ACD is 30 days. So if I looked at this wrong and I said, oh, the critical path it's only 25 days, and I told my client I could get that project done in 25 days, is that going to happen? According to this activity chart. So these are just a set of activities. We've figured out that that is the most likely time duration. So now, think about doing this kind of activity for building a car. Think about how many steps there would be in building a car. So it's the same type of activities, but now there's, instead of 4, there's maybe 100 activities. And we have to figure out what that critical path is, where that float time is, because maybe that float in activity B, maybe we can assign them resources somewhere else. So they've got 5 days. The person who does activity B, whatever that happens to be, they've got 5 days of float. I can move them to another segment, another project, another assignment for 5 days. Maybe they just take vacation for 5 days. Whatever it is, I can reassign those resources. So critical path is one of the harder things we're going to deal with, and luckily you get it in a couple of different courses. So you get it introduced in here. There is something called resource leveling, and that is where we have our activities, and we try to maximize the use of those activities and maximize the use of our resources. A lot of times we use simulation models. You'll see the term Monte Carlo. So in this, we try different models over and over and over again. And notice, does that look kind of like that horrible normal curve? In fact, it's not quite as bad as mine, but it's close. So we've tried that. So we've tried to figure out where we're going to hit a certain percentage, and we can actually look at that and say, all right, now I think with an 80% certainty that we can accomplish this entire project in this amount of time. So scheduling gets pretty tough. There's a lot of math behind it, but the reality is we have a lot of tools, and most of them are fairly easy. You rarely have to go into that detail of actually doing the math behind there. Those 3-point estimates or 6-point, those are pretty easy to deal with. You guys can all do that. We start getting the harder ones, a lot of times already built into that software, or we bring in an engineering firm to do some of that stuff for us. One of the things a lot of times you've heard the term called fast tracking. Has anybody heard fast tracking? The way we actually define it in project management is probably different than what you determine it if you're saying, hey, I'm going to build a house and I need to fast track that. What you're really saying in fast tracking is you're trying to put as many things in parallel as possible. So we know we can do some activities at the same time. Can they roof a house the same time that we are doing framing on the inside? Yeah, that idea of putting things together. So it doesn't mean that I just do it as fast as possible. What it really does is we are trying to overlap activities. This is also where we can get into trouble. Because the reality is, yes, we can do some of those activities together if everything works fine. If the outside framing isn't completed, can we either roof or sheetrock on the inside? No. So you have to be a little careful about that, how that particular functions work. So some of this is also we call something called crashing. Sometimes we need to get out a shortened schedule. So make sure you have read through. We are going to look at costs on Thursday, and I will introduce you to your rubric. My brain went completely blank for a second. The rubric that we're going to use for your next project. I am trying to grade all these PMI papers since almost everybody, well now I think everybody's actually turned it in. You feel picked on yet, Justin? Yeah. So those take a little bit for me to grade, so in the next day or so I should hopefully have those done. If it keeps raining and my water feature in the basement keeps running, it may take a little longer. All right, make sure you have read about cost, please.